Hi class. Today we're going to go over the 3 experimental tips for our class. By now you've done a pendulum experiment and you've tested whether the angle or the length or the mass of a pendulum affects the period or the time to cycle back and forth. We've probably even talked a little bit about your data and what you guys did really well and what we can improve upon. Now, let's talk about this for a second. What if I had, instead of giving you 20 or 25 minutes to do your lab, said you have 3 minutes, and I want to know whether the angle affects the period or not? And here's what a lot of you guys would probably do. You'd probably go set it up at 10 degrees, let the pendulum go back and forth, and get the period. So maybe that took 1.0 seconds. And then you did 20 degrees, and maybe you got 1.1 seconds. And then maybe you did 30 degrees and you got 1.2 seconds. And that was it. Time runs out. And I said, what would happen at 40 degrees? Should it be 1.3 seconds? How confident are you that that's going to be 1.3 seconds? And although some of you guys say, yeah, I think it probably would be 1.3 seconds, would you bet $1 million on it? Are you sure that every time you increase the angle by 10 degrees, that it's going to increase the period by 0.1 seconds? And hopefully you realize that the difference between 1.0 and 1.2 seconds isn't much. And maybe that was just kind of random. Maybe it was just a little bit of luck that it did that and it would never happen again. Maybe it's possible that the period goes down. So you shouldn't be betting your life. You shouldn't be betting $1 million that that period is going to continue to increase by 0.1 seconds every time you increase the angle by 10 degrees. So we're going to talk right now for a few minutes about the things you can do to make sure your experiment has really good data so that you can determine whether there's a trend, whether there is a relationship between two variables like I just talked about. Now, if you have this note sheet, that's great. If you don't, you can just go ahead and put these right into your notes. So the first thing that I recommend you guys do for all your experiments is to have something called multiple trials. And I'm going to give you an example so you understand what that means. So let's continue with the angle example of a pendulum. So maybe you test 30 degrees twice. Now, if you have time, it'd be great to test every angle twice, or test every length twice, or every mass twice. So the reason you're doing that is because let's say you just happen to time it wrong. You hit the start or the stop button too early or too late, and if you test it twice, you can compare those numbers to each other, because if you're doing the same experiment, you're testing the same angle twice, you should get very similar times. So if you have time, test each angle, length, or mass twice. Next step is to have a wide range of data. So what most of you guys would not do is go and test 10 degrees and then 11 degrees and then 12 degrees, because they're so close to each other that by changing it by 1 degree, you might not see any change in the period at all. So what you could do is test 10 degrees, which would be a small angle, and maybe you test 80 degrees, which is a much larger angle. And by looking at that very low angle and that very high angle, you can more visibly see whether there is a trend or not, whether the angle does affect the period or the length or whatever you're testing in your experiment. And the last thing you would want to do is have test many data points. What I mean by that is test a lot of lengths, or test a lot of masses, or test a lot of angles. So maybe here, test 6 to 8 angles. So testing many data points doesn't mean, doing 4 repeated trials. It means doing, 6 to 8 angles, 6 to 8 lengths, or 6 to 8 masses. Because if you're only testing 2 or 3, you're really not going to be able to tell if is a trend or not. And in class, you usually should have enough time to get, a minimum of 6, what we would call independent variables, or 6 tests for whatever you're testing. To summarize this would be an amazing data table. You may not have this much time in class, but many times you will. And we can go through and we can find these 3 experimental tips within here. So what they did is they tested 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 angles. So that's plenty of angles they tested. They tested each one of those twice. So here's trial 1 and here's trial 2. And then they use that to get their averages here so they can graph it later. And not only that, they tested a very low angle, 10 degrees, and a very high angle, 80 degrees. So this would be a very good experiment for our class, and we could then go ahead and look at our data and figure out if there's a trend, and we can get more involved, possibly mathematically, later on in the class if we have time. So that is it. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you very much.